Hello and welcome. Welcome to this seminar on active listening for divisive times. This webinar is led by Phoebe Milliken. I want to thank you so much for taking time to be with us, and we do hope that this is helpful to you as you have conversations about world events with friends and neighbors and colleagues. So my name is Katie O'Leary. I'm Director of Engagement at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. You can shorten that, Hartford International or HIU. Today's presentation we are offering as part of HIU's Continuing and Professional Education Initiative. So this is where we offer learning opportunities for thriving in a religiously complex world. And this is for individuals as well as for organizations. It can be in the form of workshops and trainings or webinars like today. So active listening today will be in two parts. First, the presentation, and then questions and answers. So please, during the presentation, put your questions in the Q&A box. And now I'm going to introduce my wonderful colleague, and I do mean wonderful, Phoebe Milliken. So Phoebe is director of HIU's Master of Arts in International Peace Building. She holds a master's degree in international education from George Washington University. Her background is in experiential education and peace building. And she has spent approximately, sometime back, 4 years living and working in Southern Africa. From 2009 to 2015, she taught conflict transformation skills internationally. She was with a small nonprofit here in Connecticut called Plowshares Institute that led travel seminars to the global south. And she's been here at HIU since 2015, leading our International Peace Builders program. And so with that, I turn it over to Phoebe.
Good afternoon, everyone. And for those of you joining us from other time zones, good morning or good evening. Katie, thank you for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here to talk about a subject that for me is very much the essence of peace building. So active listening is a familiar phrase. And if you're here in this webinar, you likely think active listening is probably a good thing to do. But what is active listening actually, and how is it different from just hearing things? Why is it worth doing, and how does one do it? We're going to explore those questions in the next few minutes, and then as Katie mentioned, we'll open it up to some questions from all of you. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right. So we're particularly talking about active listening for divisive times, because we recognize that many of us are finding ourselves in conflict when we're talking with others, whether that is about the violence in Israel and Palestine, or about the recent mass shooting in Lewiston, Maine, or about our political affiliations. And since this is about conflict, I want to start with my favorite definition of conflict. And I realize it's a little strange to have a favorite definition of conflict. I guess it comes with the territory I'm in. But I do have one, and here it is. It comes from David Anderson Hooker, who is a scholar of peace building and restorative practices. Conflict is two or more ideas or intentions sharing space. I love this definition because it makes conflict totally normal. Conflict is something that is part of everybody's interactions with their family, their friends, their colleagues, and it isn't wrong. It's just human. Where we get into trouble is when the conflict or the need for one idea or one intention in the conflict to be right, to be the right one, when that becomes more important than the relationship. Active listening is a strategy for prioritizing relationships over agreement, because it's a real investment of time and attention. Now, time and attention, as we know, are actually two rather scarce resources for a lot of us. Now, sometimes it is okay for those conflicting ideas to keep on sharing the space. And if that is the case, you definitely don't want to lose a relationship because of it. Sometimes you do need to come to an agreement, though. But if you allow the conflict to trash your relationship, your capacity to get to that agreement is pretty much trashed too. If you can prioritize the relationship, you can keep working towards some kind of mutually acceptable solution. So now we're going to move from my favorite definition of conflict to my favorite definition of listening. This definition isn't from a scholarly journal or a mediation handbook. I came across it years ago. It's from a parenting book by Rosalind Wiseman. Her most famous book is Queen Bees and Wannabes. This quote I actually came across in one of her books about boys called Mastermind and Wingman. And she said, "True listening is preparing to be changed by what you hear." I read this and I remember having this really split reaction. Part of me was thrilled because that part of me already believed that listening is a superpower that anybody can cultivate. And another part of me was horrified because that part of me really likes to be right. So luckily for me, a little metacognition kicked in, and I noticed I was having these two very different reactions to the same sentence. That clued me into the fact that this was a very powerful sentence. For me, reconciling these two reactions came when I focused on the word preparing. You don't have to be changed by what you hear. If someone calls you up and tells you the sky is orange, you don't have to abandon the idea that the sky is blue. True listening, though, means you are open to the idea of being changed. And if you're open to that idea, you might in fact hear that that caller is in the vicinity of a forest fire, and their sky is indeed orange. For any of you out there who are admirers of Thich Nhat Hanh, the late Zen Buddhist master and peace advocate, he has said the same thing even more strongly. He said, "For things to reveal themselves to us, we need to be ready to abandon our views about them." Again, ready to is like preparing. It's a mindset, an openness to the possibility of change. And that is key to active listening. You can have all the technical listening skills in the world, but if you aren't willing to be affected by what you hear, you probably aren't prioritizing the relationship over agreement. I have a poster on the wall of my classroom that says, "Your mindset determines the process determines the outcome." Mindsets matter. Preparing to be changed by what you hear is a mindset. Now, this quote also gets us to the idea of process, and that's getting us closer to a discussion of skills. The next thing I want to talk about sits somewhere in between an idea and a skill. And that is the capacity to separate positions on an issue from needs and interests. I want to give you an example. I've had so many conversations in recent weeks about Israel and Palestine. These are conversations with friends, with family, with colleagues, students, and former students. They are Jewish, Muslim, Christian, atheist, and no religion in particular. Some have strong sympathies with Palestine. Some have strong sympathies with Israel. Many are deeply torn. I heard a big range of positions on a lot of the related issues. But regardless of their position, people expressed the same needs and feelings again and again. I feel alone. I am horrified. I am outraged. I feel hopeless. I need my truth to be heard. I need people I care about to be safe. I need to be understood. Active listening allows us to get beyond the positions and connect with some of those feelings and needs. You feel alone? I am here with you. I may not agree with you, but I am here with you in your pain. You need to be understood, and I want to understand. help me understand. Now, understanding isn't agreement, but an amazing thing can happen when you offer someone understanding. Sometimes they offer it to you in return. Some of these needs and feelings we can't do anything about. Not many of us here can truly make people safer in the Middle East right now. Connecting with needs and feelings, even ones we can do nothing about, is important though, because these needs and feelings shape our understanding of the issues. I teach mediation, and one of the things I tell my students is not to expect to make any progress on the issues until they've at least recognized the parties' feelings. There's neuroscience to back this up. Rational thought happens in the prefrontal cortex, which in evolutionary terms is the most modern part of the brain. And as much as we'd like to believe that as highly evolved beings, the rational part of our brain is in charge, when we feel threatened, our ancient lizard brain, these bits back here, shuts down communication with the prefrontal cortex and puts us into fight, flight, or freeze. Contentious conversations can certainly make us feel threatened. Just acknowledging the emotion someone feels, though, can reduce that sense of threat and help bring the prefrontal cortex back online. So now let's talk about the how of active listening. I'm going to pinpoint 3 different skills. Here's the thing, though. None of this is rocket science. The ideas are disarmingly simple. Putting them into practice, though, is hard. Our first skill, be present. Now, this is another way of saying pay attention. And in this day and age, paying attention is hard because we are surrounded by distractions. Attention is a gift. So in order to be present, one of the things you want to do is minimize distractions. Ideally, hard conversations happen face to face. And if you're able to have a face-to-face conversation, turn off the news and put your phone down. Maybe close your door. Likewise, if you're on the phone or even communicating by text, if active listening is your goal, pick a time when you aren't really distracted, a time when you aren't also making dinner and supervising homework, or scanning email, or waiting for a meeting to start. Being present is a lot easier if you can minimize these external distractions. That's only part of it, though. That's the easier part, actually. The harder part is being present also requires minimizing the internal distractions. For many of us, that means quieting the part of our brain that likes to be right. Preparing to be changed by what we hear means we really have to engage with what is being said. One of my mentors, the late Bob Evans, had a rather blunt way of putting this. He said, figuring out your next point while you wait for someone to stop talking isn't listening, it's reloading. We have all done this. It's really hard not to do this. It's human nature to want to try to figure out what we are going to say next. So it is work not to do this. And that work is active listening. So if you commit to listening to someone well enough that you aren't generating your winning argument while they are talking, you may need to get more comfortable with some silence in a conversation. You might need to ask someone to think for a moment. And I know this can feel really odd, but rarely does anyone react badly to being told that what they said is worthy of proper consideration. If silence is really tough for you in a conversation, try having a serious conversation while you're going for a walk. You know, the act of walking can fill those quiet moments in a way that many people are more comfortable with than if they are sitting down together. Finally, be conscious of how you are signaling being present with your body language. And this is cultural. In some cultures, it is all about eye contact. In other cultures, it definitely isn't about eye contact. We send a lot of signals with our bodies about our willingness to be changed by what we hear. So be mindful of what signals you are sending. So moving on to our next skill. This is offering understanding. I want to reiterate that understanding what someone says is not the same as agreeing with them. But when you can demonstrate that you understand them, or even that you want to understand them but are struggling, and you do that, you demonstrate respect for the other person. One way to offer understanding is with paraphrasing. When I teach mediation, we spend a lot of time on paraphrasing because it's an essential component of mediation. I'm going to take us through a somewhat abridged version here with a slimmed down definition of paraphrasing. So paraphrasing is repeating in your own words what someone else has said. This does not mean you have to be a walking thesaurus. You don't have to come up with a synonym for every significant word that someone said. You just need to take what they said and make it a little bit your own so you're not parroting what they said, but you can use plenty of the same words that they used. Paraphrasing also attends to both issues and feelings. Often a big part of what people are trying to communicate to us is what they feel about something. So when you're paraphrasing, you want to pick up not only on the action or the issues of what they're talking about, but if you can, how they're feeling about that. That will help them feel understood. Paraphrasing is focused on the speaker. Often, when somebody says something to us, we are tempted to then just talk about the related thing that we did that seems like a natural segue from what they did. But that is not focused on the speaker. That may be a valid thing that you want to talk to them about, but it isn't paraphrasing. That is something you need to hold off on a little bit so that your paraphrasing is focused on what they told you. And finally, paraphrasing withholds judgment. Now, this is the hardest part because judgment comes in a lot of different forms. Certainly, if you tell someone that their idea is crazy, that is judgment. But if they tell you something which is difficult for them and you respond with, "Don't worry, I'm sure it's not that bad," that is judgment too. You may mean to be reassuring, but what you're communicating is that their feelings about this matter are wrong. As a related note, this is also why the phrase calm down is probably the most useless phrase in the English language, because people feel judged when they hear that, and being judged is not calming. So we're going to work through an example here. So imagine someone says to you, "I'm so upset with our political leaders. Have you heard what they said about the recent mass shooting? I've written to my representative for all the good that ever does. Sometimes I wonder why I even vote at all." So you could say, after someone says this to you, "You wrote to your representative about the shooting." And that would be a paraphrase of the issue. But in this case, that wouldn't be sufficient because a big part of what this person is communicating is they're upset. So an important part of paraphrasing would be getting to that feeling of what they said. Another typical response to something like this would be, "Well, I wrote to my senator about that," but that's not focused on the speaker. That's about you. So you want to hold off on that. It would also be really tempting to say, "Voting is so important. You have to vote." But that's judgment. So I'm not telling you to totally refrain from mentioning your message to the senator or your commitment to voting. Just don't say those things first. Offer understanding first, and then offer your ideas. People are going to be much more receptive to what you have to say if they feel understood. So here's an example of a full paraphrase. "You are deeply frustrated with our politicians when it comes to gun violence. It feels like your voice isn't being heard." Now, if you're a mediator, you're going to do this level of paraphrasing for almost everything that gets said. In regular conversation, though, that gets cumbersome. In a regular conversation, you want to put in a few paraphrases. Use paraphrasing occasionally to help offer understanding. Pick some of the most important things that people are saying and use that to paraphrase, to demonstrate your active listening, to demonstrate your desire to understand them. Another thing that you can do is slip in some sort of mini paraphrases, picking up just on one element of something somebody said to help them see that you are indeed listening and processing what they've said. When I do this, I most often try to pick up on the feeling. So a mini paraphrase could be something for this one like, "You are really frustrated." That tells the person you're hearing a really important thing that they're communicating, which is their emotional state about this. So now I'm going to move on to the third skill, which is asking questions. Again, it's no secret that one way to show someone you are listening is to ask relevant questions. In a challenging conversation, though, the way you phrase the question matters. Traditionally, questions start with who, what, where, when, or why. But in situations which are fraught, or if trust is low, these sorts of questions can feel like an interrogation and inspire defensiveness. By contrast, open questions are invitations to share. And I'm going to show you some examples. So you could ask someone, why do you think that? And that could come across as sort of an interrogation question. You can get to that same question in more of an invitational way with, would you say more about that? Again, you're looking for the same sort of thing, but you're phrasing it differently. You're phrasing it as an open question, as an invitation. Another sort of closed question or interrogation style of question would be, where is your evidence for that? A different approach to that sort of question could be, would you be willing to explain the evidence to me? Now, again, you're still getting to this idea of evidence, but you're putting it in a share with me. I'm inviting you to tell me more about this situation. So another sort of question, what were you doing the day of the protest? You might want to rephrase that as, tell me about the day of the protest. So these questions are getting at the same material, but going about it in a different way, going about it in a way which is an invitation. And because this way of asking questions is not just useful when you're talking about world events, I have our final example here. How could you fail the math quiz? I can almost guarantee you that conversation will go better if you try something more like, help me understand what happened with the math quiz. So as you can see, I've got questions here in quotation marks because some of our open questions are actually statements. As a side note, the phrases, would you be willing and help me understand, are two of my most essential tools, both professionally and as a parent. They're the sort of invitations that people like to say yes to. And I'm not giving away any secrets here. This is not a magic trick. You can know that these phrases are powerful and they are still powerful. You don't lose any power by giving away a secret. My own two teenagers are well aware of my love of the phrase, help me understand. And it's still just as powerful, perhaps because it signals a willingness to be changed by what you hear. So you can say this in all sorts of situations, including things like, help me understand why Israel is important to you. Help me understand the Palestinian history you mentioned. Help me understand is a phrase that does a lot of active listening work for you. I'm going to bring us towards a close here by telling you about a recent conversation I had with two Hartford International students. They're friends. One is Jewish and one is Muslim, and they're having conversations with each other about Israel and Palestine. What I heard them say is that they are prioritizing their relationship over agreement. Their views are not polar opposites, but they are definitely different. And as the Jewish student said, these are conversations, not confrontations. They're even able to find moments of humor in these conversations. The Muslim student talked about using open questions to learn more about Judaism from her Jewish friend and about how her views of Israel were related to or not the same as her religious beliefs. I heard them say that these conversations with each other and with other people were both very hard and very important. Attitudes like genuine willingness to understand each other and skills like paraphrasing were making them possible. I'm always excited when I hear about people using these skills because it takes real commitment. These ideas are simple, but the practice is hard. So if you want to engage in active listening, be present, offer understanding, ask open questions. Things like paraphrasing often feel awkward at first, so it takes commitment to try again. It does get more natural with practice, and practice is required to get to that point where it feels more natural. And the hard work does pay off. So in summary, peace building almost always requires work on relationships before there can be work on problem solving. Active listening is a way to prioritize your relationship as you figure out how your two different ideas can share the space. So thank you. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to invite Katie back on and we can move into questions and answer.
Thank you. That was very helpful and very good. And I imagine that it has awakened in our participants here some questions. So I've got one to get us started here. And then if you would all weigh in and let us know what you're thinking and what your questions are, that would be great. I'm curious, Phoebe, actually your household must just be very harmonious. And I wonder too, but it must be very gratifying. And I don't know whether you've heard this from the backseat of your car or maybe at the dining room table, one of your children say, help me understand. Right?
Yes, I have. They also tease me sometimes for using it, but they still respond really well to it. So yes.
That is awesome. That is awesome. So if everybody operated this way, it just sounds like it would be so helpful. And I wonder, this person is wondering too, don't both people in a conversation need to use active listening? What happens if it's only one party, not the other party?
Yeah. So in an ideal world, yes, both parties would be using active listening, and that certainly makes conversations tend to go quite well. But even if only one person is using active listening, it can improve these sorts of conversations because that act of demonstrating that you want to understand someone can really sort of lower a difficult emotional temperature. It can help people sort of settle down and engage and respond more thoughtfully. It does that thing of lowering the threat, and so their prefrontal cortex comes back on. And yes, when you offer someone else understanding, they slow down and they say, okay, this person is really willing to engage with me on this. And then often that allows them to engage back with you. They might not be paraphrasing you, but they may be listening to you a lot better than they were at the beginning of the conversation when they didn't realize that you were serious about wanting to understand what they were saying. So only one person doing this can help a lot. Though two is ideal.
Yeah, absolutely ideal. And in fact, this has raised a lot of additional questions here. And it's the power of words, isn't it, too? Not only, the body language and everything. If someone receives a statement as confrontational, you deliver a statement as perceived as confrontational, and that was not your intention, how do you kind of dial that back?
So a statement about what you said, yes, you can certainly say, look, I see that what I said is upsetting to you. Help me understand why that upsets you. The same tools you can use again, because certainly this will happen. That you can bring. You can calm the situation down with what you say, and then it gets heightened back up again when somebody hears something that they deeply disagree with or that they find painful to hear. But you use the same tools to say, all right, let's explore that. Help me understand that. Tell me more about why the thing that I said is so upsetting for you.
I think someone can obviously tell too if you're really earnest in your genuine in your inquiry and your invitation.
Yeah.
Here's somebody who says, thank you so much. Does inequality, inequality in power dynamics in a conversation change the dynamics of active listening?
That's a good question. It can. I think it's maybe a little easier to paraphrase when there's sort of an equal power dynamic going on. I think it's a little harder to paraphrase somebody you perceive as more powerful than you, just because people tend to be a little more reticent in those situations. But you can still, even if you feel awkward paraphrasing someone who might be more powerful than you are, you can still use your open questions, you can use your body language, you can do that sort of minimizing distractions to do active listening. So it's not always about paraphrasing, which I think is the thing that's hardest if you're talking to somebody who is more powerful than you. If you are talking to somebody where you are the more powerful person, paraphrasing is great. It can really be helpful because it really demonstrates that even though you are the more powerful person in that situation, understanding the other person is still really important to you.
Yeah. And here's somebody who says she has a friend who is good at active listening with kids. When she uses these techniques with adults, she can come across as condescending, which upsets people. So there's a real art to this too, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a real art to this. I think tone of voice is important in every conversation. And when we think about the different kinds of questions, sort of an interrogation question versus an open question, you can ask who, what, where, when, why questions in a way that don't come across as interrogation, but you've got to get your tone of voice spot on to do that. With open questions, you have a lot more leeway in tone of voice because the phrasing is different. But yes, tone of voice can affect how your conversation is being received or could be seen as condescending.
Yeah, this is generating so many questions. I work in healthcare. Discussions with patients often involve right information like a diagnosis or treatment options. Patients can disagree, but that doesn't change the reality of the situation. Is there a way that education or information sharing fit with active listening strategies?
Oh, healthcare is hard because often healthcare providers have very little time, and these kinds of conversations take some time. So I think you can certainly acknowledge that the patient is reticent to take the advice, and even acknowledging that might then sort of lower their defensiveness and make them more willing to think about it twice. If you have a patient who is not going to do what you're advising, that this could help a little bit, but it's probably not going to change it entirely. But I think the way you present the information could help somebody think about it again once they're out of your office too, that if it's presented in such a way of, I really want to be responsive to you, but I also have some facts that you need to hear. If they get the sense that being listened to and being understood was important to you, they might rethink their own position later on when they're not sitting in front of you.
I think this relates to the next question here, who thanks you, by the way. She says she's going to practice these tips with the tone. Relationship being a critical factor. What if you're drawn into a conversation with whom somebody you don't know well?
Well, to think about, you're drawn into a conversation. If it's a conversation about a contentious topic, at that point, you have a little tiny bit of a relationship with that person because you're having that conversation. If it's somebody who you have no interest in discussing this with and you're never going to see again, you might decide, do I want to dedicate this time and energy to having this conversation, or do I simply want to extricate myself from this situation? If it's somebody you do want to dedicate that time and energy to, yeah, you don't have a lot of, relational cues already, but you can still use some of those same skills to help that person feel understood.
Absolutely. Yeah. Somebody here says it's that somebody with very strong views who wants to debate and argue. What do you do? Just
You
back
accept
away,
it.
right?
You paraphrase that feeling. You can say,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
hear this is really important to you, that you have really strong beliefs around this issue and that you've done a lot of thinking about it, and expressing what's important to you is so important. So you recognize that, you let the person see that you see that that's what's going on with them. If they have no interest in hearing what you have to say, even when you're recognizing that and doing active listening, there's not a lot more you can do about that. But it may be that in recognizing that and doing some of your active listening for what they have to say, they do settle enough to be willing to engage in what you have to say.
Absolutely. Somebody picked up here on, you had talked about mindset determines the process determines the outcome. Can you kind of further dive into that?
Yeah, I have a couple stories I can tell about that. First day of the class that I teach on constructive conflict intervention. This is essentially the class on mediation. I invite everyone in the classroom to find a partner, and that we're going to do a warm-up exercise. And so everyone finds a partner, and I say the word partner several more times as they're all getting into their groups of two. I explain this warm-up exercise in which I never say it's a competition, but most people assume it's a competition. And we then begin this exercise. It goes badly because people assume that it's a competition. I then stop the exercise and I say, what did we call that person standing next to you? And someone always calls out opponent. I said, really? Did I say opponent? And then someone says, no, you said partner. This happens, it's almost like it's scripted. It happens the same way every year. And I said, yes, I said partner. In fact, I said partner 7 times in setting this up. But there's a lot of mindsets we bring to situations that make us assume that we are in competition. Now, I want you to think about that word partner. I want you to recognize that you are in partnership with that other person. And we're going to do this exercise again. We do the exercise again. It goes entirely differently. It goes very well. And so then I stop and I say, okay, what changed? What changed between the first time we did it and the second time we did it? And what people say is, I changed the way I thought about that person I was working with. My mindset changed. And then their behavior in the activity changed, and the outcome was entirely different. So the way that you think about that affects the way you go into it. And I think this is sort of a metaphor for sort of all peace building processes. How do we go into situations in which we transform it from being opponents to being partners with a shared problem? That is the essence of peace building work, is getting to that place where you are partners with a shared problem. Now, this works, in the classroom in this canned exercise because it's designed to work this way, but it works in lots of other situations too. Here's another example from my life. Several years ago, the Department of Motor Vehicles, through a clerical error, unregistered my car, which became a real issue for me because you're not allowed to drive an unregistered car. So I then borrowed my mother's car to drive to the Wethersfield office to try to get my car registered again. And this was a hassle. I had to take time off work. And I recognized as I was driving to the DMV that I was in this very confrontational mindset. I was upset. This was not my fault. I'd been a good citizen. And here I was with this unregistered car. And I realized that my mindset was going to be a problem when I got to the DMV. And so I counseled myself to change my mindset, to remind myself that I wanted my car registered and the DMV wanted my car registered. We were not opponents. We were partners with a shared problem. And that allowed me to really I changed the mindset. It changed the way I approached the people in the DMV. And indeed, we got my car re-registered, and it didn't even cost me any money. So the process went better, and the outcome was what I wanted it to be. So this idea of mindset determines the process determines the outcome is something that we can bring to lots of these situations, which we know are going to be tough, but we would like to engage in a way that allows us to respect the other person, to prioritize the relationship.
This relates to a question here. A person is interested in somatic practices that might precede or accompany active listening. So often, as you just described on the drive to the DMV, adrenaline is involved in conversations and can tilt them toward confrontation. How do you manage that energy rather than be managed by it? And you just spoke to that, didn't you?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, if you can alter your mindset, but there are certainly somatic practices as well. If you can take some deep breaths, before you get into a conversation, that's really helpful. I know if I am running a dialogue circle, I actually build deep breaths into that dialogue circle. After each person has said something that's important to them, I ask the whole group to take a deep breath and let it out slowly. And that slows the conversation down, which is good in itself, but also those deep breaths allow for people to calm down. It signals to the body that you are not threatened when you can take a deep breath. So that helps.
Benefited from that, you leading that, experiencing that, it does exactly that. That pause, that deep breath is just transformative. It's fantastic.
We have an ambassador, Joe Coletti, who teaches public speaking here to our students. Another technique that he tells students to sort of reduce adrenaline when they're going to be public speaking is to wear closed-toed shoes and wiggle their toes, because that fidgety energy, adrenaline often comes out as a fidgety energy. So channel it into some place where you can fidget, where it's not going to be you jingling the change in your pocket or, doing something else, which is really distracting during that time. So I love that. Wiggle your toes.
That's a great tip. That is a great tip. What strikes somebody here as well as me is cultural differences. And you have a lot of experience with cultural differences, both in particularly how does somebody demonstrate presence? How is that influenced by culture? And as well as, this culture is very competitive. You talked about competition versus partnership. Speak to culture, if you would.
Oh, yeah. Culture makes conversations more complicated when you're speaking cross-culturally or interculturally. And so you need to read somebody's body language too, that there are some cultures around the world or some individuals in any culture who don't like to be paraphrased. So if you see somebody whose body language seems to be getting tenser if you paraphrase them rather than more relaxed, yeah, stop paraphrasing. So you can watch for body language to see how what you're doing and how that's being received. That's one way to go about it. You can also acknowledge the cultural differences. You can say, I really want you to feel respected in this conversation. Help me understand how I do that for you. It doesn't need to be a secret. It can be text, not just subtext of what you're talking about.
Excellent. Somebody was asking here about the warm-up question. I don't know if that was back when you were looking at interrogation versus, does that ring a bell?
Warm-up question.
No, okay. How about somebody who's experiencing microaggressions, which is a different kind of confrontation, but can you speak to that?
Yeah. So if you're experiencing microaggression, boy, this is not precisely my field. I know it's really challenging. I think that you can acknowledge that something hurts and see if the person is willing to talk to you about it. If they are, some microaggressions are really unintentional. Someone doesn't recognize that they are hurting you. So you might want to say in that case, like, I understand you're trying to communicate something to me, but I have to tell you that lands differently for me. This is how I am hearing what you're saying. So you could do that. That is an invitation to that person to try to get into that conversation. Some microaggressions are very intentional. And in those cases, it might be much harder to draw a person into a conversation about what's happening.
I heard you, and I can't remember the context. I once heard you talk about, maybe it was kind of a rule for interaction, saying ouch, like
Yeah.
letting.
Yeah, and I do that in dialogue circles as well. That if you hear somebody say something that hurts, uh, as a facilitator, I might not realize what has happened. And so I tell people, you can say ouch, you can say, ooh, it hurts me to hear that. And that can be an invitation to the other person to explore. If they're really angry, they might not want to explore that with you, and that might not be the good time for that conversation. But we do unintentionally hurt people we care about.
Yeah,
It's just part of being human. It's part of engaging with others, is we can hurt them without meaning to. And so saying, ouch, it hurts me to hear you say that. If you're talking to somebody who cares about you, that really can be a way to get into what just happened in that moment.
absolutely. Here's clarification on the question regarding warm-up question. That was in the context of how participants describe the partner when the prompt question, what was the prompt in that exercise?
So I may have students who show up in my class in the future, and I don't want to describe the details of this, because then you go into knowing what's going to happen. So I'm not going to divulge more of that exercise.
Okay.
Sorry
Right.
about that.
There you go. There you go. Is social media, how does all this relate to social media? Somebody wants to know.
Social media is a minefield. Social media is not a listening space. Social media is great if you need to make a statement about something. Social media is a terrible place to try to listen to anyone. So I think if you are, if you want to have a serious conversation with somebody about a world event or another important issue to you, I would not choose to do it on social media. I would get in touch with them some other way to have that conversation. There's no way to control for tone of voice on social media. There really isn't.
No, not at all. Just share it to pictures of what you had for lunch or the shoes that you almost bought. Yeah. Well, we are coming to a close here, and this has been very, very helpful. We're grateful to all of you for being the kind of people who care about this subject and who want to learn how to interact with each other in the way that we've been talking about. So thank you very much, Phoebe, for this.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And we do hope that you will join us next week, a little earlier, note the time, at 11, trauma-informed approach to conversations about world events. Obviously, this is, part of the same thing we've been talking about here today in the context of what goes on in the world. And as a reminder, this is something we feel very strongly about, this sort of offering as part of continuing a professional education for individuals as well as for organizations. We hope that you will keep that in mind. Go ahead and register for that. We hope to see you soon. And again, thank you for being here. And thank you so much, Phoebe Milliken, for designing and leading this session.
Thank you, HIU, for wanting to have this session. I appreciate it.